Okay, Denise.
Okay. Hi, I'm Denise Lockett. I'm here with Legal Aid of North Carolina, and I'll be presenting today on domestic violence and the older adult. First off, I would like to thank Naiquan Zhang of Duke University for helping prepare these excellent slides, and I hope they're informative. Much of the information in the slides is from the National Clearinghouse on Abuse Later in Life. It can be found at www.ncall.us and also from NAPSA, the National Adult Protective Services Association. They have an excellent podcast if you're interested. Now, let's get started. We'll go over 3 basic areas today. First, how do we know what we know about elder abuse in North America, and what do we know? Second, what's a common misconception about the cause of elder abuse? Third, how does abuse affecting older adults differ from what you might see in younger adults? Recent studies have offered some really eye-opening information about elder abuse and what we're seeing in North America. This is really a tip of the iceberg problem. A study in 2009 that was nationwide by telephone showed that 5,777 respondents who responded, of those, 1 in 10 had experienced abuse just in the past year. Of those experiencing the abuse, only 1 in 14 had reported it. So let that sink in. Of those who had suffered emotional abuse or coercive or controlling behavior, that comprised 60% of the group. But of those, half of them had experienced it at the hands of an intimate partner. The highest risk factor for financial abuse, physical disability. Further information was gleaned from a recent study on dementia patients who had been targeted for having problem behaviors. That could be lashing out, or it could be being verbally abusive with carers. Of those surveyed or studied, half had suffered physical or psychological abuse. What were the most startling factors or predictive factors that were correlated with abuse? The fact that the care recipient, the victim, had previously abused the carer, and also the fact of isolation. In addition, higher instances of abuse occur when there is a shared living arrangement with the carer. Now, you'll see a lack of social supports comes up time and time again in these recent studies. And so that's why when we talk about prevention, we're going to really focus on that. Another recent study revealed some further shocking data about abuse suffered by those who have carers in the home. So for those experiencing physical, emotional, and/or sexual abuse, much of the recent research has looked at the perpetrator, and this is really helpful because in the past we just really haven't had good data. What are the factors that are correlated with abuse by the carer? Things like substance abuse, unemployment, untreated mental health issues, housing dependence on the victim, so adult children sometimes living in the home or other relatives living in the home and dependent upon the victim for their residence and for even food and utilities. And then a general attitude that was identified as being hostile, so misanthropes, people who were angry, and it hasn't been addressed. Next, let's look at what happens when you're not in the community anymore. If you're in a nursing home or an assisted living or even a group care home. A few recent studies have looked at that and what are the greatest risk factors. And you might think, well, it's the behavior of the victim or the kind of the carer that the victim's in contact with. In fact, the biggest noted risk factor were the conditions related to the facility itself. Some of those issues include the facility's failure to have a formal elder abuse prevention policy on the books, not having enough staff training and education about abuse prevention and how to see what it looks like, what are the indicators, not screening staff sufficiently, high staff turnover, a very closed culture in the facility, and then having a crowded physical environment. Some factors that were noted that caused a resident to be at higher risk include unmet physical or mental health condition needs, not frequent visitors or no visitors at all, so having insufficient social context from outside of the institution, and then any kind of extreme cognitive impairment or physical disability. Another excellent study, it was not nationwide, it was New York State, but it was a pretty comprehensive phone study. And it revealed that the respondents there also revealed that 1 in 10 of them had experienced abuse in that past year. Of those who experienced coercive or controlling behaviors or physical abuse, only 1 in 24 reported it anywhere. Of those experiencing financial abuse, only 1 in 44 reported this. And why? Why is this not getting reported? Well, people report they're ashamed. People report that they're afraid to report, and then they don't know where to turn. One note that we would add here, because this was a phone survey of people in the community, these are folks who are higher functioning, able to respond to a fairly lengthy survey and able to have access to a phone consistently. So when we think about the numbers, and I mentioned earlier, this is a tip of the iceberg problem, let's think about how many more are out there, because if you have 1 in 10 in this survey reporting abuse, how many more are out there that are just not even able to say, this happened to me? So how do we prevent it? Well, awareness is key, and so I'm glad you're part of this conversation today. More and more information is coming out that social supports and social connections, whether they're formal networks that are set up or whether they are just informal, familial, or friends that you meet volunteering in a neighborhood, neighbors who check in on one another, any kind of support from outside the home or outside the institution is highly protective. So it's the connections that we need to make and maintain that can help prevent abuse. Also, things like the survivor's willingness and ability to reach out for help, and the information that they're provided. Is it useful? Is it something that's going to help them safety plan for next steps? And can they prevent future instances of abuse by having access to appropriate resources? Is it about caregiver stress? This is the myth that I mentioned initially. A lot of people think, oh, when abuse happens in a home or in a facility, it's because the victim or the survivor, somehow they were really trying and the carer was very overburdened and they just snapped. There's kind of a depiction of, a long-suffering spouse who is dealing with someone with dementia who's gotten violent and suddenly they just lash out one day. Or an adult child who is working 2 or 3 jobs trying to support mom or dad, and then they're burning the candle at both ends. They've just, gotten to the end of their rope and they make a mistake. That impression is based on old research from the early 80s, small studies that were flawed. And in fact, the studies focused on the narratives of the abuser. So the abuser was justifying his or her behavior by saying, I'm overburdened, I don't have enough supports. Well, that seems to be problematic, doesn't it? We are not getting the narratives of the survivors, the victims of the abuse. And further data, further surveys have shown that most families providing significant elder care are experiencing stress, and yet we don't see a high correlation between the level of need of the care recipient or the amount of stress and whether or not domestic violence happens in the home. So we have to look at a case-by-case analysis when it happens, what's going on. And we kind of covered this, but it's not so much about the carer being stressed, but other factors that might influence this dynamic. So let's look at what is correlated with violence against an older adult. The abuser's dependence on the older adult, as we've discussed. So for financial, emotional, even social supports, that role where the abuser is relying on the older adult for a lot of their daily needs, living together with them. And then if the older adult has previously abused in some form the carer, there's a high correlation of further abuse, but it now is against the older adult by the now caregiver. One reason that we've taken so long to figure out some of these dynamics is that, frankly, there's not been a whole lot of money put into researching this. And frankly, there is still a cultural predilection or bias towards thinking of domestic abuse as not a problem significantly affecting older adults. We just don't see it. And in fact, a telling 2000 study, and I think this was a phone survey in Canada, revealed that when people were asked, the person on the street, what comes to mind when you think of family violence, 81% said child abuse, 80% said intimate partner abuse, but only 9% said any kind of older adult abuse. So that's pretty glaring. You might be familiar with the power and control wheel. It's often used in domestic violence shelters and sexual assault survivor settings to help describe all the various forms of control that are used by abusers against survivors. And you'll see that traditional wheel, the Duluth model wheel, is on the left. On the right is one that was adapted and designed by older adult victims who themselves had suffered abuse. And I want to point out some of the things about that form of abuse or that cohort of victim, that what they experience is different from what we typically think of with domestic violence. So if you look, you can see, and this you can find it at the ncall.us site, by the way. But this wheel describes some important things that we can be on the lookout for as members of communities who are concerned, right? So some of the forms of violence and control are things such as intimidation, and that would be things like raising a hand or getting up in someone's face, threatening a pet, and we know how important pets can be to an isolated older individual, sometimes even removing the pet, threatening to sell the pet, that kind of thing. With emotional abuse, it can be things such as name calling, ridiculing the older adult's religion, clothing choices, interests, mocking them in any way, infantilizing them, treating them like a small child. Isolation, as you know, is huge when it comes to older adults who might have limitations in terms of transportation or even physical mobility. So keeping them from family and friends, keeping them from a faith community, taking away access to a phone or a computer, those kinds of things that further victimize and further help the abuser gain control, whether it's over the person or the finances or both. Minimizing. Again, this is something that we can see time and time again with the older adult victim, making it sound like they're making something up, saying, oh, you know, it's just, you know, she's slipping, he's just angry and trying to get me in trouble, that kind of thing, saying that, oh, he knows how to push my buttons. Those kinds of things that are simply geared towards keeping the older adult a victim who is discredited in his or her community, if they do even have an opportunity to reach out. Withholding, misusing, or delaying needed supports. That can be things like withholding medication or over-medicating, using physical restraints, barring a door, keeping someone from a cane or other assistive device, withholding needed things such as taking away hearing aids. Those kinds of things that perpetuate a cycle of control and make the older adult further vulnerable to abuse. Economic abuse is something that unfortunately we see highly correlated with the physical abuse, and especially if someone is sharing accounts. Many times you will see older adults who no longer have access to bank statements, no longer have access to even a purse. There are situations where the older adult has someone who, through a power of attorney, has gained control over their finances, and things become liquidated, and the older adult doesn't even know what's available to them as a resource. So there's a lot of self-dealing that we need to keep an eye out for as a part of the abuse pattern. Caregiver privilege. Oops, sorry, I just went past. So that's part and parcel of what we were just describing. It can be making unilateral decisions about the older adult's resources. It can be ignoring the wishes of the older adult and just acting as if they don't even have a stake in their own day-to-day activities. And finally, coercion, threats, and even physical abuse, where the older adult has been beaten down verbally, sometimes even physically, into feeling as if they are helpless. And there's often a threat of, well, if you don't like it, I'll put you in a nursing home. Or if you don't like it, who else is going to do it? And so again, that goes part and parcel with the isolation and control. So these are the things that we want to look out for. I do want to mention briefly, I don't have a slide on it, but we've talked a lot about older adults living in the community. And I think as neighbors, we can be good neighbors by trying to check in, by trying to build bridges. Even in a time of COVID-19, we could do phone calls, we could offer to run errands and things like that. But what about the folks who are in a care setting, whether it's a nursing home or assisted living or other form of group setting, congregate care? How do we watch out for them? Well, a big part of it can be education, doing what you're doing now. Learn to look for signs of abuse. So unexplained bruising, sudden behavioral changes, sudden weight loss, toileting problems, look of fear when a certain carer enters the room. Those are the kinds of things that we can look for as family members, visitors, and just caring members of a community when we meet with someone in an assisted living or nursing home setting. So as we think about what our options are as community members to protect others, briefly, this is a kind of a higher level overview of the older adult abuse experience, also available on the NCL website. But I wanted to give you some resources here. If you do suspect abuse, or if you're experiencing abuse, there's a national domestic violence hotline. It can put you in touch with your local support network for domestic violence, 1-800-799-7233. Or if you have access to a computer, you can look up your local agency for domestic violence or sexual assault. Also, there's always 211, the United Way number for community resources. You can find great resources such as your area agency on aging, programs for in-home aid, food assistance, many resources available to help an older adult have stability and protect them from abuse, as well as to help the rest of us. Finally, all of us are mandatory reporters if we suspect abuse. So remember, you have a Department of Health and Human Services serving your community, and you should report it if you suspect abuse. Adult Protective Services is there to respond, and it's their that's what they're tasked with doing, and it's our duty to be our brother and sister's keeper, right? Finally, the Ombudsman program in North Carolina will investigate if there is a concern with a facility and an individual in the facility who has a need that's unmet, or there's a concern about the health and well-being. There is a statewide number, 919-855-3400, but there's also a local one for your area, and you can look it up on the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services website. Finally, Legal Aid of North Carolina, available to assist. We have 2 hotline numbers. The Senior Law Project is 877-579-7562, and our centralized intake helpline is 866-219-5262. So thank you very much. I'm going to see if we have questions. Oh, thank you, everyone.